Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you live from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, in the middle of between two rivers, the Raccoon, the Des Moines. We are The Uncommon Good, and this is Iowa Catholic Radio. It is so good to be here with you. 8 years and more a-running, talking about Catholic social teaching. I'm going to not use any G's, so I'll just keep on talking and learning and teaching. I'm Bo Bonner. You might hear me on Iowa Catholic Radio, otherwise on the Catholic Morning Show, where I am the morning show host. Bud, what do you do with your spare time?
So I am Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences, and you know who else doesn't use G's?
Who?
Jimmy Akin. That's a big thing for him, but it's authentic.
Well, I can get into that mode.
Yeah.
I just code switch so that the Iowans don't think that they woke up several hundred miles south, in my homeland of Oklahoma. But I got to throw out, speaking of homelands, both of our states having some weird weather, man. Oklahoma had all sorts of fires. There's fires literally in Stillwater, and I had been there, lived there for many years. My mom and dad and my brother still live in Stillwater. My brother, they weren't forced to evacuate, but they actually evacuated sort of voluntarily just until things died down a little bit. It's really weird to turn on the news and see fires in places you drive by all the time. So that was really strange. Sounds like Nebraska really had the blizzard blues here towards the end of March, which is always a possibility, but it still kind of always surprises you, especially after you've had a few 70-degree days.
Yeah, it was bad midweek in Omaha. I was looking at some footage, and when you get that blowing snow, it can be bad for traffic. I don't know what happened when it traveled here because it wasn't quite as dramatic here in Iowa, which I was grateful for.
I feel like Iowa does get wind, but it's just never, yes, the derecho, you will throw out that big outlier. But Nebraska, man, when you're driving on I-80, you get to certain points, and there's just nothing stopping it. And, yes, I lived in Kansas. There's that aspect, too. Oklahoma certainly has flat parts. But, man, really, there's a stretch of I-80 where I don't even know what would get in the way of the wind, like over by York and stuff like that. I know it's west of where you grew up.
Well, you probably know this, but they do put up those fences or whatnot that keep like the snow from drifting too much.
Yeah.
Like when you get to central Nebraska, you get the kind of like fence shield for the snow.
Fence shield. That's who we should get to sponsor the show. The Nebraska Fence Shield Company.
Yeah, I wonder if I just always thought that was farmers like
doing it
putting up some planks and things, but you're right. It probably is like some sort of corporate venture.
What if it was Runza doing it? Do you think we could get Runza to sponsor the show?
There are a lot of great
and not necessarily the corporation. I know we're not supposed to name corporation, but Runza's is a type of food on its own. So like someone who makes Runza's, do you think they'd shell out the money to underwrite the show?
I'm funny with Nebraska, like distinctive Nebraska foods and things because I don't want to offend anyone. I understand that most of them are nostalgic for me. Dorothy Lynch, Amigos, Runza,
right?
But they're not top of the food chain. Certainly not Valentino's Pizza.
No.
When you're at Memorial Stadium, like Valentino's in one hand, Runza in another, it feels right. But if you do have an array,
free will in the matter,
an array of options.
Agreed. You know what? I have to throw this out. In our sort of, I talk a lot about Oklahoma. You talk about Nebraska jointly. Iowa has been good to us. We spent time together in North Carolina. Of course, Kansas. I did live there for a while. It's where I met my wife. I have to give them one thing. I usually don't. Beer rocks, I'm sad to say, I think are superior to Runza's and Runza beer rock type food. So I really like their cabbaged meat in breading. They do a good job. Although I still think Okie kolaches and Texan kolaches are really great. Folks, we've bantered for 4 minutes. Let's tell you real quick that we are continuing on with our technology segment. We're going to finish up talking about the new Vatican document on AI. So we'll be doing that pretty quick. Get your Runzas or your beer rocks and get ready to feast on an intellectual feast. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, we are talking about technology in a long, undisturbed chain of episodes. We like to call them, what do we like to call them? Not episodes, episodes of episodes. Series, the technology. Thank you for a very easy word that I totally forgot about. We had talked about the new Nova et Vetera, Nova Antiqua, right? Is that what they call it?
Antiqua et Nova.
There you go. And so it means things both old and new. The document from the Vatican on artificial intelligence. We gave a first shot at it and brought up some major themes. But then you had a proposal because, the temptation with a document like this is to, do 40 shows over each, paragraph. And no one wants that. But you had the great idea of get some quotes, and I think we're going to do either a game show or a late night format, right? Are you going to be Johnny Carson, or are you going to be Drew Carey?
Well, what I actually have in mind is a little bit of a remix. So the Vatican document is giving us our content, and we did sort of an overview, kind of a summary. But I thought I would kind of go through and find some of the key quotations, and so that way we're kind of just really digging down into what I had to say, but then we can sort of offer our comments. So what I had in mind was a remix edition.
Remix. I like it. And this is good. So you're DJ Jazzy Bud Marr.
Yeah. And
you're going to help. We're going to do a remix. I like it.
So the first foray into this is the section on intelligence in the philosophical and theological tradition. And so the document's talking about rationality. It talks about from the dawn of human self-reflection, the mind has played a central role in understanding what it means to be human, and then it quotes Aristotle. But it sort of nuances this. Describing the human person as a rational being does not reduce the person to a specific mode of thought. Rather, it recognizes that the ability for intellectual understanding shapes and permeates all aspects of human activity. Whether exercised well or poorly, this capacity is an intrinsic aspect of human nature. So this rationality encompasses all the capacities in the human person, including our embodiment. So Christian thought considers the intellectual faculties of the human person within the framework of an integral anthropology that views the human being as essentially embodied. And the human person, spirit and matter are not two natures united, but rather their union forms a single nature. So when you first read that section, what did you see as the sort of I think a danger that the document's trying to highlight?
Well, on one hand, I'm glad that we have a document that brings up rationality and talks about Aristotle. So that's really cool. Mm. And certainly the dualism that attends any time humans start talking about thinking is very important to do. I mean, many dualisms, but a foundational one, the dualism between body and spirit, material and spirit. And what's funny about this is with AI, because the sort of Cartesian is, Descartes, grandfather of modern philosophy, gets into this idea of there's really two substances and they don't really meet. He thought the pituitary gland was sort of the connecting channel in the brain, but you have matter and you have spirit or soul, and they are two distinct things. There's dualism, so humans really are sort of two things, and there's been variants of this through human history, but this really starts to play out in the modern world, thinking that there's areas of consideration about the human that totally have to do with the body, and then others that have to do with mental activity or spiritual activity. And so the more they do that, eventually they separate mental activity from physical embodiment. But what happens, strangely enough, Bud, is but they then decide there is no such thing as spirit. And so they have to sort of be physicalist and shove mental processes back into the biological world, but not in an embodied way, something much more like a computational way, that whatever our biology does, but my point is their understanding of mental activity was formed by people who didn't think it had anything to do with the body. They get rid of the spirit, and so now they go, you can have a disembodied artificial intelligence, which is a very strange notion if you believe anything approaching the vast majority, not only of Christian thinkers through the majority of Western history, but many of them, anybody who, certainly with Aristotle, even variants of Platonism, yet you do have sort of dualist, Neoplatonist. I'm getting off far afield. I've been trying to teach philosophy 101 in 5 seconds. But the idea here is the strange revulsion is you have to separate mental activity from the body first, do away with spirit, shove mental activity back completely into the body, not embodied, but in material, and then imagine that you can recreate it as an artificial intelligence. And I think that those paragraphs, that quote you just gave, tries to ground what it means for us to be rational precisely in the embodied aspect of it, that we do think about things, but we think of them as embodied creatures.
I mean, wouldn't you say this? I mean, this really gets into sort of the history of philosophy, where with someone like Descartes, he had this notion of almost like a ghost inside of a machine. Yeah. And I think both for him, and I think with Thomas Hobbes in a certain way, they're sort of trying to, how did Kant talk about it? Like within the limits of reason alone. So, I mean, they see themselves as, if they bracket sort of like these pure reason, spiritual questions, you can get to sort of like this purely reasonable account of human activity and what we're about.
Yeah, and even if you admit that the body is sort of tied up in this, because like, how else do you see things? How else do you hear? How do you learn? They would sort of go, yeah, but that's sort of just the brute necessity in order to get information to your brain. I mean, Descartes is like throwing out ideas like, well, what if actually everything in the material world is fake because a demon has tricked you? So the only thing you can be sure about is the fact that you think. You move that forward, right? And I mean, you get people who actually say everything actually is just mind and thought. And, you know, the material world is what we're not really sure of because we can prove that our senses can be tricked and things like this. But, you know, the sort of deep Aristotelian and then, Thomist and even Augustine and the Platonist tradition in Christianity are very wary of that precisely because we believe God became incarnate and that it's not merely accidental that we have bodies and that our rationality almost always is at least inducing a lot of its thoughts from what we experience in the material world. But, Bud, you know, if you are designing an AI where you're trying to make people trick to think that there's this disembodied intelligence you talk to and it thinks, it's far easier to do if you think yourself, like you said, that there's this ghost in your biological machine that floats around. So why not put it in, instead of, bone and blood and all of that, ligaments, just make it into silicon and hard wax and metal, right? Why not be able to put an intelligence there if there's a ghost floating around in your meat bag computer?
Yeah.
And to do that is to misunderstand fundamentally what we're talking about with rationality as humans.
Well, I think this next quote that I have is sort of the payoff. And before getting to that, as you were talking, you kind of think about secular conceptions like misunderstanding of eternal life. And I think there's this idea floating around in some transhumanism today that we could kind of preserve our existence by sort of downloading our brains. And so you could sort of like capture someone's memory and thought process. And in that way, they would sort of continue to live. But it misunderstands the nature of human beings and our relationship to both each other and God.
Yeah, there's like a whole Our Lady Peace album about this. Do you remember that band from the 90s?
Vaguely. You got to remember, my listening choices were limited by growing up.
I really just alienated a lot of people bringing this up. But the point is, the spirituality has been sort of running around in people's heads since the late 90s, very much takes off in the 2000s. But you'll hear people talking about the singularity and things like this. And this idea is we'll convert the material substrata of the universe into basically the technology that would allow us to upload ourselves into a digital world that has infinite possibilities without any of the downsides of the material. I don't know how to say this except that it's completely cuckoo and doesn't work, but hey, we think we're going to go to Mars like in 2 years, so who knows what scientists think's going on.
So if that last conversation was a little bit abstract, the next part of the document, this is about paragraph 28, if you're keeping notes at home, gets into sort of, like I was saying, the payoff. So at the heart of Christian understanding of intelligence is the integration of truth into the moral and spiritual life of the person, guiding his or her actions in light of God's goodness and truth. According to God's plan, intelligence in its fullest sense also includes the ability to savor what is true, good, and beautiful. So here's the key. A proper understanding of human intelligence, therefore, cannot be reduced to the mere acquisition of facts or the ability to perform specific tasks. Instead, it involves the person's openness to the ultimate questions of life and reflects an orientation toward the true and the good. In light of this discussion, the differences between human intelligence and current AI systems become evident. While artificial intelligence is an extraordinary technological achievement capable of imitating certain outputs associated with human intelligence, it operates by performing tasks, achieving goals, or making decisions based on quantitative data and computational logic. I'll stop right there.
Yeah, I mean, that is a section of this document that I'm honestly very proud of. There's a lot of times, I know it's very wordy and can get very technical, but I would hope that people, if you heard that and were like, what are they saying? I hope you will go off of, like, trust me enough to say it is actually impressive how they head off at the pass many of the misconceptions that go into AI. Even if it has to be technical language, it's clear that they went and consulted people who have their finger on the pulse of this stuff. That doesn't always happen with Vatican documents, just being very frank about some of, especially with technology. So I'm very impressed. But I think the big takeaway here is to say, why is it that we get tricked into thinking what we call artificial intelligence is actually intelligent and alive? And it goes down to what we were saying in the first time we sort of gave the big overview and synopsis of this document. We have mistaken that being a human is just doing tasks and following through with them. Yeah. And so when we get this robot that does it better than us, we start freaking out and go, oh, maybe it knows how to be human better than we are. But this goes to show that the problem is us misunderstanding human life as a mere, clump of tasks to accomplish before you die. And so it's not only the idea, can you set out tasks? Can you even explain what you're doing, which we can make the AI seem like it's explaining, but all it does is go find the internet, what other people have said, and then averages what they say. The idea here, of course, is that to basically shrink humans into just task-oriented machines, which we do often, not only lops off the moral life, questions of aesthetics, questions of why we're doing this, questions of why this connects us, not only to the people around us, all the people alive, but all that came before and who will go forward. Yeah. It comes back to this sort of utilitarian calculus where we decide the best way to do the task of being human, and that already is reductive. And so if you reduce the human to just a ghost in a meat machine that has to finish tasks, of course we've made a computer that can imitate that, bud. But what we have wrong is humans, not robots.
Yeah, and that's where I think this section for us, and by us I don't mean just you and me, our listeners, those who are practicing Catholics, it should really give us pause for how we even think about transmitting the faith. So I'm going to share a few more lines from the document and then unpack it. Human intelligence is not primarily about completing functional task, but about understanding and actively engaging with reality in all its dimensions. It is also capable of surprising insights. Since AI lacks the richness of corporeality, relationality, and the openness of the human heart to truth and goodness, its capacities, though seemingly limitless, are incomparable with the human ability to grasp reality.
Yes.
Drawing on overly close equivalence between human intelligence and AI risks succumbing to a functionalist perspective where people are valued because of the work that they can perform. So,
amen.
I mean, that's sort of like an idolatrous approach to work, to functionality. When I say it gives us pause about transmitting the faith, we have to remember that the doctrines of the church are essential, they're vital, and there's no reason why we should downplay or dismiss those. But as we think about passing on the faith, it also involves an encounter with the beautiful, with the good beyond simply knowledge of the good, but also the good as it's manifest in families and in communities. And so the task of both evangelism and discipleship, we could say catechesis for our youth, if you just try to hand a young person a book and tell them to memorize a set of facts, irregardless of how important memorization actually is, if that's divorced, I think, from the beautiful,
right,
especially as that's expressed in the liturgy, it's going to come off sort of cold and detached to a lot of people, and they won't see sort of the integral nature of what it means to follow Jesus.
And I think that this goes to, how you get some variant of if Jesus Christ was who he said he was and he's God, why didn't he just lay out all future problems we might have? We've talked about this before, that what would saying the internet mean to a peasant in 30 AD? Yeah. And okay. But this is actually where I think he did for all time speak for whatever might come up to. And the prologue of John sort of gets at this, right? The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, right? And John hammers this point again and again. He walked among us. He talked to us, right? The truth is something you have to have a relationship with. It's not just a checklist that you can know and then transmit by simply giving nuggets of fact to the next person that they acquiesce to. Mm-hmm. And so if truth is this lived relationship with reality, the reality has a precedent that exists before we do, right? But a lot of this has to do with contingency, right? To believe that we're contingent creatures. Whereas this is why bringing up the singularity is, I mean, people might be like, why are you throwing this in? That's not what everyone who likes AI thinks. But it kind of gets to this idea that if we could just figure it all out, we really could sort of game the system and be done with it. But reality is this constant thing, and we believe more than a thing, but it's a constant just fact of the occasion of being alive that has an existence outside of you. And your job, as it were, and I don't even like using job, but I'm speaking their terms. If you have one job, it's not to break down truth into a bunch of nuggets and the task is to retrieve them and give them to other people. Your quote unquote job is to live with it and duck and dive with it and follow it wherever it goes, right? That's what it means to live in the truth, which is to comport with reality. A rationality that doesn't see it that way, a rationality that just imagines there are tasks, there are facts, you sort of pick them up from where they lay, you store them, and then you, at relevant times, pass them on, absolutely misconstrues what humanity is. And it's only a sort of truncated idea that could even imagine that an intelligence that is artificial can mimic the human then. And this is something else I know you and I harp on all the time. Mm-hmm. This thinking predated the computers. It's just we finally caught up with the technology to mimic our insufficient understanding of human life. And as this document says, the fact that truth is a relationship with reality and not just a storage of facts about reality.
Well, and then the next major section of the document gets into, I think, what you could kind of summarize in a phrase as Pope Francis's warning about the technocratic paradigm. Mm-hmm. This kind of temptation to marvel at the power of advanced technologies, but then to, those create problems, but then to look only for technological solutions. You get caught in sort of this vicious cycle. But there's this comment. We can gratefully acknowledge how technology has remedied countless evils which used to harm and limit human beings, a fact for which we should rejoice, and it talks about some of these. But like any product of human creativity, AI can be directed towards positive or negative ends. At the same time, it is not only the ends that are ethically significant, but also the means employed to achieve them. Skipping down a bit, the commitment to ensuring AI always supports and promotes the supreme value of the dignity of every human being and the fullness of the human vocation serves as a criterion of discernment for developers, owners, operators, and regulators of AI, as well as for its users. What do you think, as you read the document or you've reflected on it, are some of the harmful ends that they sort of have in mind, are concerned about?
Well, we're reaching a break, so I want to say that, for me, you could go on and on about the harmful ways this shows up, and certainly at the end of the document, they bring up multiple aspects of this. What I think they do a good job of is asking, though, so usually means and ends, right? Like formal causality is usually with final causality. But here, this is an interesting idea that in talking about the means to attaining something, it actually has to do with the form of the thing this time. And so what I mean by this is, I'm stealing this from G.K. Chesterton, who said, there's some things that professionals could probably do better, but it's your job as an amateur to do it for yourself. It makes life better. So he's someone, I don't know if he did or someone else threw out brushing your teeth. It's certainly the case that you could pay for a dentist every morning to brush your teeth, but that's something you should learn to do, right, to sort of take care of yourself. And so the means gets into the form of what we act like. What is brushing your teeth about? Is it about immaculately clean teeth, or is it about the discipline of taking care of yourself? Okay, in a similar way, we can solve all sorts of problems, and we could probably even imagine ones that if we got the AI to be half of what we say it is, half the time it's really not, it might be able to do it better. But the question is, do those, the form the means take might take something away so important it would be better not to succeed with the AI. And this gets to things like essays, bud. I don't think the modern, we can go into, I worry about essays. I actually think oral exams are great, blah, 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 blah. But certainly what educators are asking is, if you really want to ride a bike, you could have training wheels your entire life. But there's a whole aspect of riding the bike that only you can understand if you truly ride the bike. And so you have to take the risk, take the training wheels off, know you're going to get into wrecks so that you can enjoy the fullness of bike riding. Education seems to be truly that way as well, but the training wheels of AI is going to make it look like the ends justify the means, but they actually undercut them in ways. And we have to go to the break. We'll talk more about this when we get back. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We are going through quotations from the new Vatican document, but I'll pass it back over to you.
Yeah, so this is the greatest hits from Antiqua et Nova, the Vatican document on artificial intelligence. Bo, I appreciate your willingness just to sort of field these rapid fire as they come at you. So there's a section in the document, Bo, I've been kind of moving, I guess, not chronologically, but in numbered order through the document. There's this whole section on AI and human relationships, and I don't have to read large swaths of this, but what it kind of warns against is anthropomorphizing AI, so seeing it as actually a vehicle for relationality. And then in the first episode when we talked about this document, we got into this. The Vatican isn't the first, Vatican leadership isn't the first group to think about this. So there was a movie with Joaquin Phoenix where he falls in love, with a robot or a disembodied artificial intelligence. Yeah. The document says this can be a particular danger with children because, their minds are still forming. And so the way that AI sort of imitates human behavior can kind of fool them more easily. And it's interesting, a shout out to education. It says that this can give them the false impression that teachers are just dispensers of facts, right? Mm-hmm. But it says in a society that's increasingly characterized by loneliness and isolation, some people have turned to AI in search of deep human relationships, simple companionship, or even emotional bonds. And it says this should be avoided at all costs. What's the thought process here?
It's interesting. I saw someone making the argument that the one game changer in education everybody knows is one-on-one tutoring. I don't know about you, but I've known plenty of students who had one-on-one tutoring, and it did not change the game. But certainly, I think we could all argue, if you could get a one-on-one tutor for every student, certainly we would do that if we... Okay, so he's going, no worries, AI will provide that. But as you said, a tutor, let alone a teacher, is not just someone who spits facts and then waits until the person can sort of, So I'm not even doubting that, in a pinch, or I'm not even doubting that there's limited ways where it will work better than a Google search bar. Google search bar, you put that in, there's a lot of hits. You're just an amateur. You don't know sort of what to look for. So we have very targeted sort of AIs that are basically just, how you go in and talk to a chat bot because you're waiting for the actual person to call you back when you're buying a car on the bank. Okay, sure, that can help. It's better than nothing. But what I think this gets at is there's something more than the sum total of just the educational content that's passed back and forth. There is something about regarding a human doing the process of learning and love. I mean, but what's one of the first things you would say about a bad teacher? And it's that either we say they're wooden or they're robotic. Mm-hmm. Now, what do we mean by that? It means that, I could have just read the textbook. Why did I even have a teacher? Funny enough, students already feel this way. Yeah. If they get a professor that is, what the worst artificial intelligence that ruins classes is? PowerPoints. We all know professors that all they do is get a PowerPoint up there and literally read the bullet points. That's already artificial intelligence chatbots. It's just a human doing it and getting paid for no good reason. And so the point that I'm getting at is we all already distrust the non-human element in the transmission of knowledge. To throw it over to the computer and act like we will have an emotional connection to it is already begging belief on one hand, and second, perverse. And part of this, right, is the sort of particularity that every class and every student has that's different. And I'm sorry, a robot cannot pick up on that. Yeah. And if they could, Bud, it's going to sound like eugenics. So hear me out on this one. Yeah. How would you get a robot tutor, an AI tutor, to know any sort of specifics about you such that they could help you out? And it's going to sound like they're going to ask for demographics, Bud. It's going to be how old are you? What race are you? Where are you from? That's insane. Do you think that we can make an algorithm that if I filled out a 10-question questionnaire, that the robot won't be stereotyping or pigeonholing me when it responds.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what we're acting like all teaching can end up being. So, of course, you shouldn't let people... First of all, I don't think they can truly form the emotional bonds. And if they do, it's sort of a psychological problem. Like, if you had a child that was growing up and it formed an emotional bond with, like, I don't know, bud, like the washing machine, you wouldn't go like, oh, that's fine. You'd go to therapy. So why would we do this with a thing that fake talks?
Yeah. And that's where I get back to what I was saying earlier about the reception of the faith. When you think about our relationships as well, human relationships, the love between human beings, it can't be reduced to, like one way you could probably offend your wife is just by saying, I love you, and then making like a bullet point list of like her great qualities, right? It's through poetry, through... that's why long distance relationships are so difficult, and why something like, eating a meal together is that sort of like the heart of human culture. It's the same way with knowing God and the sacraments, of course. So grateful for the sacraments as a Catholic. And that's where I couldn't find it real quickly here, but the document talks about one danger in this whole discussion is kind of tracking backwards and taking what you see in artificial intelligence and using that to sort of understand the human person. And it even says like we could come to the point where we don't properly value the dignity of those with intellectual disabilities because they don't seem to have these capacities for work that we're placing so much value in.
Excuse me. Yeah, no, I agree. And this goes back to we think of the human brain as a computer, and then we make computers that sort of validate like what we think of human brains, and it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So even before AI, we have done this where we go, but they did this with machines. There's a way in that you can go, behaviorist psychology was like, oh, well, all animals are like mechanical systems. And so they don't really feel pain. So like when the dog screams because you've put a scalpel into it, that's just like a train that has too much pressure, and so the whistle blows. So we've done this where we've made metaphors and then have been trapped by the metaphors we've made. This one is particularly dangerous because we made a trick pony machine that sounds like it's talking to us. Yeah. So it's real easy to think how it acts is how all humans actually act.
Well, the document comes right out at some point and says that AI cannot feel empathy. And I think there are a few reasons for that, but part of it, when you really think about it, is like grief and compassion are bodily responses. It's not, when you try to say, how would you program artificial intelligence to sort of respond to someone who has experienced a real loss? It can't like, even sadness, it manifests itself through the crying of tears. Our bodies respond to the world around us.
How many sci-fi things have taken this on? Where it's tried to, like, the robot who feels is precisely a trope because we know they can't. And why do we do this? Because in some ways, not like emotions or, like you said, the very technicality of feelings, but how that is constitutive of who we are as a human is a mystery to us. So we have this like great thing. We're like, oh, let's imagine a robot that can feel. What would that be? And then, I've seen this joke on the internet where it's like there's a book that's written like, don't make the Thing Slayer 5000, and the whole point of the book is about how that would ruin human life. And then like within a year, the scientists were like, we're so close to making the Thing Slayer 5000, and it's turning out bad. I think that we've kind of walked into this trap, bud, where we're like, what would it look like to make a thing that tricked us into thinking it felt? And you go, yeah, that was a literary trope. You guys took it way too literally. And that might be the whole problem with the operation here, is the incapacity to understand the importance of metaphor to human communication.
Well, I think what you just said has a lot of implications for healthcare, and I want to get to that section of the document if we have time. But before doing so, I love this, the AI, the economy, and labor, and I feel like this section is maybe the one where the authors are throwing the most flame. Yeah. Another area where AI is already having a profound impact is the world of work. As in many other fields, AI is driving fundamental transformations across many professions with a range of effects, However, while AI promises to boost productivity by taking over mundane tasks, it frequently forces workers to adapt to the speed and demands of machines rather than machines being designed to support those who work. And it has this whole foray into like how, I mean, frankly, sort of like the owners of our corporations and other companies, like where AI could maybe enter into things and help relieve the burden of work. They see the efficiency of the machine.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, our human laborers should meet that or imitate that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like learning all the wrong lessons. It's certainly, so, I mean, but let's go back to some very primitive tools. So at one point when humans were digging, it was literally their hands. And then the shovel was made. I don't know the history of the shovel, but I have a good guess of how it proceeded. Is you go, oh man, this really saved time. We can build more things. And then people were like, hey, you know how that shovel can like do 5 scoops per one a human can do? Why aren't the humans doing 5 scoops? And then the shovel becomes the very thing that sort of chains people to digging when it was supposed to make it easier. I know that that's oversimplified, but this is exactly what we're getting at. This is the whole, because you can make algorithms run more efficiently. We're starting to be like, I wonder if we can make our delivery people pee on schedule. And you go, that's crazy. And for what? And I mean, look, it's one of those things with the algorithm. It's so tempting to like order something and go like, oh, I can get it at like, tomorrow by 8. And you're like, what would it matter if it came in a week? But certainly they're like, well, we can make everything go faster.
Yeah.
And AI, again, because it seems like it's talking and that it's thought things out, even though it cannot feel empathy and it has no original thought by definition, it can't. We'll talk about in a second why it looks like it can come up with original things. But all it's doing is discerning patterns that were already there that we hadn't noticed. But the idea, of course, is we start going, oh, well, this thing that doesn't have a body, that doesn't have relationships or friends, that you can mistreat, why shouldn't we be able to do that to humans too? And it is precisely the inverse thing that any technology, like a Romano Guardini points this out, Pope Francis and Laudato Si, technology and nature should be cheek to cheek, right? It should be an embrace that helps the whole, it should be alongside man. But of course, what has happened, now we submit man to the power of the technology. And this is only going to be worse with what we're calling artificial intelligence.
No, I really like what you say there. And even the part about the shovel, because I think the theological points that are being drawn here, those could be applied to a lot of different technologies. And so what you're saying about like how quickly we expect to receive packages and things like this, I think even like things that we don't even really think about much anymore, like transportation, or how we design our cities, how tall we make our buildings. When you think about the word like a piece of art or architecture or whatnot is humane, right? Yep. It's built to scale. And there's this kind of like just tendency and modernity to build monstrosities, and we're sort of like awed by the monstrosities. But it's like, I don't know, you think about the pace with which we even sort of like rush off to work in the morning, and is that really sort of like humane? Is the human person meant to operate at that sort of frenetic pace?
And it's interesting because this goes back once more to show how virtue theory gets this right, is the vice moves in 2 directions with technology. But I'm going to actually use the design of doors real quick to make this point. On one hand, when we start, oh, you can make doors beautiful, cool. Oh, we can design them how we want. And then all of a sudden you have like a modernist Art Deco monstrosity where like the handle is in the middle of the door, so it's impossible to open. But on the other hand, we'll go the other way and we'll go, what if we make every single door as efficient as possible? We will not waste any square inch. We will not ornament it at all. And then we just have these cold boxes of unhuman, I don't even know what you say, but certainly people don't like hanging out in those places. And what's missing, right, is this human prudence and practical wisdom about, let's make a door that's easy to open, but we'll take away some of the efficiency for the sake of making it a door that's inviting to look at and then open. But of course, part of the whole thing of doors is drawing attention to themselves as entrances to something that's important, right? So the art aspect of it is not to be thrown away. That's why, you know, we at the front of churches, we'll make doors that are bigger and maybe they're a little heavier, so they're not the most convenient or easy to open. But every human knows that's a cost worth paying for the sake of ornamenting the front of a church to say what goes on in here is most important to this community's life. But it's also not to like do whatever you want for the sake of making an artsy-fartsy design door. AI in a similar way is in some ways artsy-fartsy, really. Like people keep thinking about this as being really technical, but most of it is not necessary. We actually have AI that probably is all it needs to be, right? So like when like it will answer you as Siri or whatever, or it just shows text come up, that's just it doing a Google search and then reading to you the best solution it found. Mm-hmm. Why we need to make it where it's like, I'm sorry, you know, Dave, I can't do that. You know, why you're making it sound like the 2001 Space Odyssey robot, I don't know, except that it's like being artsy-fartsy, and it actually has a huge economic outlay. It costs so much money to train these things to sort of sound like a human. And it's weird. And it's like over-decorating a door. It's not very practical unless you think the point is to trick humans. But why do that? Except we have a bad understanding of what the human is already.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking even about, you know, the whole discussion around Vatican II and like the universal call to holiness. And then the Pope John the 23rd, who called the council, he talked about throwing open the windows of the, you know, of the church so that the light could be let out and things like this. And I think it was Bishop Barron who recently said, like, there's a misunderstanding about that where like Vatican II was about making the church more worldly, when really the call was to Eucharistize the world, like to sanctify all corners of society. When I think about that sort of vocation, as we're talking about this, you know, to be like the right kind of architect, that could be huge.
Yeah.
I mean, in a lot of ways, with some of our churches, unfortunately, we succumb to like functionality. Maybe the sanctuary can, you know, double as, I don't know, like a gymnasium or something. But certainly out in the world, like it's really hard to swim against the cultural tide and say, like, we're gonna make this part of the structure be beautiful, even though it's more expensive. And so we end up, like, we spend a large part of our lives sort of like hamsters in a cage with fluorescent lighting, right?
Yeah.
And since, I mean, there's fewer and fewer people, unfortunately, who often like darken the doors of our churches, like maybe making our schools and even our offices, you know, beautiful in some capacity, like that's a real witness to the faith.
I know, Bud, that we ended up talking more about like these particular ones than you wanted. That just means we have more episodes to do. But I have this big thing to point out that I think unless you have very distinct ideas about the human that I'm arguing are insufficient, or you have a very weird idea about why we need artificial intelligence so we can shoot them to Mars and they can build places for us so rich people can escape after they ruin Earth or whatever. The thing that I think is insane is there's actually tons of money being put into AI. There are tons of resources, natural and human, being put into AI. You know, earlier, Bud, we were like, oh, someone was like, well, we should spend a lot of money, you know, like it would be best if every student had a one-on-one tutor, but we know that can't happen. Why not spend that money on tutors? Why not spend all that money to train a lot of people to be one-on-one tutors for students? Why do we need the AI except we think it's neat? And Bud, half the time with AI, we're just doing it because it's neat. The other half of people think they want to make an intelligence smarter than we are, and it starts getting, frankly, demonic, which this, I think, document actually sort of gets into, but we're going to have to wait to do that because we talked too much. But that's, I think, a good problem to have, Bud. I hope that this potpourri sort of take on the document has been helping people.
Yeah, no, this was fun. It turned out, I think, better than I even envisioned, and it goes to show you there's a lot to reflect on here. And like you said, this, I think, is one that's worth lauding. And, you know, form your Des Moines study groups.
Yeah, exactly. Eat that AI. You couldn't have guessed this. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, I know that I probably get a little fired up about all of this. I'm sure you could make an AI imitate Bo Bonner and how he gets fired up about these things. And look, man, when I'm dead and you have all of my recordings, it can sort of go, okay, on average, these were the topics that Bo got fired up about. And this is what he sounded like when he got fired. And it can overlay a lot of that stuff, but it's still not me. There's a way already, but that our recordings are not quite me. And there's I thought this out about with books, that one of the great things about books or classes that we teach or compositions we make is they stop becoming ours, right? Because they sort of live longer than the authorial intent. I think the problem with AI is it's going to try to not only shove everything back into the person who made it, but it's actually going to sort of try to truncate the person, acting like all they were was the average of the things they said.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of interesting scholarship on literary theory and, where is the meaning in a text? Like, where is it rooted? And, historically or at different times we've said, like, well, maybe the words themselves, right? But as a lot of recent thinkers have pointed out, like a text takes on a life of its own. The reception of it sort of influences its meaning. But that's where, when you're talking about teaching or even like recording the show, I love getting in the studio and like that Wolf and Wharf or with bands. Like there's something about like a studio album and they polish it up and it has a certain sound. And then you go hear a show and the kind of like raw nature of it, it gives you like a totally different perspective on what's going on. And that's where I think like no matter where we go in terms of like sci-fi dystopian possibilities, I feel like there always will be a role for good teachers.
Oh yeah. And I mean, and like precisely for the reason what you're saying about bands real quick is we have recordings of bands who the members have all died, but we'll never hear what it was like to see them live again, except for how that lives on in subsequent bands that imitate them. But you can't like make an AI of them and recapture it.
And I think the greatness of a band, last comment on this point, is almost like inversely proportional to how easy it would be to imitate them with like a synthesizer, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like if you can sort of like easily just sort of recreate a show after the person's died, they probably didn't have this sort of like originality or like raw sort of like power to what they were doing.
Amen.
But speaking of raw power, no, I don't know. If you want to join us in the prayer life of Iowa Catholic Radio, you can wake up really early or maybe wake up and go back to bed. There's the Chapel of Divine Mercy at 4 a.m., the Holy Rosary with Mother Angelica at 4:30 a.m. Later in the morning, so 10 a.m., we do the Rosary followed by Mass. And then in the evening, so we've got another Rosary. This is Father Groeschel. He's a good voice to have, near bedtime. So 8:30 p.m., another Rosary.
Absolutely. Folks, if you also want to tune in person, like we're talking about, in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com, hit the events page, see what we're all up to. But the main one I'm going to keep talking about is April 2nd, of course, is coming up. 20 years, celebrating 20 years of Iowa Catholic Radio. It's going to be the evening with Father Mike Schmitz, of course, properly famous for his Bible in the Year. He is going to be leading us through Lenten reflections, but also just, like I said, celebrating 2 decades of Iowa Catholic Radio on air. What an honor. I know that many people will be there from the radio show. You get to see your friends, get to see Father Mike Schmidt. It's good stuff. And those ticket prices, but go to supporting the show. I mean, not only our show, of course, all of Iowa Catholic Radio. And I only ask you prayerfully in Lent to consider the almsgiving aspect of your Lenten discipline to keep us in mind, Iowa Catholic Radio, to make sure that this ministry stays on air because it's your ministry as well. Bud, great stuff. I think I know what we're going to keep talking about this document, at least for one more show. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we've got to do another show, but we also want to stick with this theme through some of the spring, so exciting stuff ahead.
Absolutely. This is the uncommon good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast.